All right, guys, I want to do a sermon recap. The sermon Transformed, we talked about two altars. Would you rather bow at the altar of fear or at the altar of faith? And every single one of us probably say, well, I want to live the life of faith. You know, we talked about the story of Elijah and how he had these two altars, and he said, how long are you going to limp between two opinions? You know, if God is God, serve him. If Baal is God, serve him. How long are we going to bounce back and forth between, saying we want to live a life of faith, but actually living a life of fear? It's time to step in to faith. And what we learned is that both faith and fear require sacrifices and obediences. I mean, if you want to live by faith, it requires sacrifice to live by faith. It requires obedience. Faith without works is dead. But in the same way, fear, if you're going to live by fear, it requires a sacrifice to live by fear. And there's certain things you have to obey in order to live and fulfill that life of fear. And what you fear really establishes the boundaries of your freedom. If you're afraid of heights, you stay low. If you're afraid of outside, you stay inside. If you're afraid of people, you stay alone. And so living at the altar of fear actually limits what God wants to do in our life. And so we look at the church in Ephesus and how, Satan overplayed his hand, and then this amazing God thing happened right after that. And Satan always overplays his hand. He intentionally overplays his hand, I believe, so that he can distract. And while we're caught up in the distraction, he can sow these seeds of fear. But it's one moment in the presence of God that can change everything. And that's what happened to the church in Ephesus. But even in that, Satan was sowing some sort of seed, because we know as we go all the way to the end of the book, and the letter that the Apostle John writes to the church in Ephesus some 40 years later, that he says, you got a lot of great things going for you, but you've lost your first love. And so he encourages us to come back, encourages us to come back to our first love. And when you embrace love of God, the love of God by faith, the altar of fear has to crumble in our life. And so I just challenge you, just like John did, that it's time to get back to the love of God, to step back into the mystery of who God is, to the fascination of who God is, to our first love, to those encounter type moments, going back to those moments in our life where we had these encounters with God, and remembering those things, remembering the works, as John says, that happened at the first, not so we can recreate those moments, but so that we can recreate the atmosphere in our heart that allowed those encounters and those moments to happen. And so stepping back into the fascination of who God is, embracing the love of God. Let me just wrap it up, this recap, with this story that I told in the message about Thomas Aquinas, who was a 13th century philosopher and theologian, and he had written all these wisdom writings, and he's sitting in a chapel staring at the cross, and he hears an audible voice, and the voice is Jesus, and it says, "You've written well about me. What would you like as your reward?" And Thomas just simply says, "Nothing but you, Lord." Because Jesus is enough. Jesus is all that we need. And so we're reminded of that. We've got to come back to that, to come back to our first love and embrace the life of faith and the love of God by faith.